Welcome to the Transitional Justice Workshop on the ADRN online seminar. Today's seminar is on the history of human rights violations in Asia, bringing justice and accountability to the present. So the healing wounds of the historical atrocities. The main question we are going to address is what kind of efforts have been made by Asian democracies to ensure the justice for the victims. So today's workshop, we have the three presentation. So let me just introduce myself. I'm Hyunjun Kim. I'm a professor at the Korea University. I study international human rights and international norms, and then transitional justice. I major in South Korean case, and then I study the history of human rights violation, and then the transitional justice in South Korea. And then I'm also tracing the development of the democracy and then human rights in the region. Okay. So today we have three panelists and then the presenter. The first presenter that I'm going to introduce, and then we have three country case, the Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and then Korea. So for the Sri Lanka paper, we have Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu is a founding executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives. He was a secretary of the consultation task force on the reconciliation mechanisms, and then the first winner of the Citizens Peace Award presented by the National Peace Council of the Sri Lanka. He was a founder of the Transparency International Sri Lanka chapter and has been nominated for numerous peace awards. He is quoted widely in the local and then international media on Sri Lanka. And then Dr. Saravanamuttu will present on the on the Sri Lankan case. And then we also have Dr. Chin Woo is a associate research fellow at the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, Taiwan.
Yeah.
He received his PhD degree from the University of Michigan, and then his main research interest includes the impact of the economic development on the political regime dynamics, and then how the regime types influences the economic performance. Today, as mentioned, we will be addressing the question of the human rights violation and then transitional justice in the region. And I think this is a very timely issue, not only because of the widespread human rights violation that still is in the region. Think about Myanmar. And then in case of Myanmar, many people are also considering the many reconciliation or the transitional justice measures as one of the important topics that should be implemented in the country. And many people have been looked in those countries which have gone through the human rights violations and then transitional justice in the past, South Korea, and then the Taiwan, and then Sri Lanka. We also have some other models in the region, like Indonesia, East Timor, or the Cambodia cases, but those are sometimes related to the many cases in international or hybrid form of the transitional justice. So by looking at three countries, I think we will get some good and then very important insights about the human rights violations and transitional justice. Today's seminar will first have a first round of a presentation on Sri Lanka and Taiwan, and then South Korea, 15 minutes each for each presenters. And then we'll leave about 40 minutes of the discussion related to the presentation. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just pass to Dr. Saravanamuttu for the Sri Lankan case.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the situation in Sri Lanka pertaining to transitional justice. As most of you may know, Sri Lanka is currently undergoing its worst economic crisis ever. And it's a crisis of governance in particular, which has an economic dimension and a political dimension. The economic dimension relates to the gross profligacy of the Rajapaksa government, the dwindling foreign exchange reserves, the spiraling inflation, and the grossly adverse exchange rate vis-a-vis the dollar. There are power cuts, there are queues, there's a scarcity of food, a scarcity of essentials. People are protesting all over the country, and they're demanding that the Rajapaksa government get out of politics and bring back the money they allege that the government and this particular family has stolen from Sri Lanka. So in such a situation where the emphasis is on accountability and the fight against impunity, one would have thought that transitional justice would be at the fore. However, going back to 2015, which was the first time that Mahinda Rajapaksa, the president who won the war against the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, when he was defeated in his bid for an unprecedented third term as president, again, accountability was the issue. In the majority community South, the accountability meant accountability for the corruption, the financial corruption of the Rajapaksa regime. In the north and east of the country, it was accountability for the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Rajapaksa administration were accused of. This has now returned in that across the country, the argument is about accountability, where the argument about accountability is much more about the financial corruption than it is with regard to the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So in that respect, the current climate is not particularly propitious, promising to bring up the question of accountability for war crimes. But one hopes that if there is going to be not just regime change in Sri Lanka, but systemic change, the issue of the importance of human rights, its integral part of governance in the country, will once more come to the fore, and the question can be revisited. Now, the allegations of war crimes and the crimes against humanity have been made against both the government of Sri Lanka as well as the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. The argument, nevertheless, in the country at large, and this is an argument in the majority community Sinhala Buddhist South, is that when you talk about war crimes and when you talk about crimes against humanity, when you talk about transitional justice, this is a way of trying to get at the government, get at the majority community, punish the armed forces, because there is no LTTE to answer for these crimes. They were militarily defeated, they have been politically dismantled, and therefore there is no one to answer for these war crimes. But that's not entirely correct, because there are ex-LTT cadre and leaders who have joined up with the government, and they can be held responsible for war crimes. But the chief accusations against the government of Sri Lanka are, of course, what caused the key issue of transitional justice. Now, transitional justice in that respect, pertaining to particular crimes with regard to the circumstances in which the final days of the war was fought. The allegations are with the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of self-proclaimed no-fire zones, the disappearances that took place during the war, as well as of those people who surrendered to the armed forces at the end of the war. Nothing has been accounted for. There are organizations, the families of the disappeared, who now since 2009 or even earlier, have been campaigning, have been going from army camp to prison camp to government institutions, trying to find out as to what has happened to their loved ones. But they have got no answer. The argument against anything being done was that, look, our war heroes in the security forces must not be turned into traitors and war criminals. The government of Sri Lanka, in that sense, and irrespective of whatever political party, has given a blanket assurance that no members of the security forces will really be tried for any of the war crimes, because that would be to say that the people who won the war won it in a very unfair and brutal fashion. And furthermore, that if we are not going to do it domestically, take up cases with regard to allegations, allowing any kind of international investigation would be a violation of our sovereignty. So, despite making a joint communique with Ban Ki-moon in October of 2009, after the war ended, to investigate the issue of war crimes, etc., nothing has happened. The government has done only the act of setting up commissions to look at it. The most famous one was the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which said that, look, the Sri Lankan army, the Sri Lankan government did not engage in war crimes as a matter of policy. However, there might have been instances where this happened, and therefore those instances must be investigated. But no investigations have actually taken place. As a consequence of that, the issue has moved to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where in 2012, we came up with resolutions on Sri Lanka urging the government to implement the recommendations of its various commissions. The failure of the government to do that led to, in 2015, with the change of government in Colombo, an unprecedented situation where the government of Sri Lanka went to Geneva and promised to set up 4 mechanisms of transitional justice and reconciliation. One was the Office of Missing Persons, 2, a Truth and Justice Commission, 3, a commission with regard to rehabilitation, restitution, and 4, an international tribunal with, a domestic tribunal with the participation of internationals as prosecutors and even as judges to look into the question of war crimes. Now, that was made by the Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka in 2015. In the meantime, there have been 2 instances where international probes have been done and have come to the conclusion that there have been instances where this could possibly have happened, and there must be investigations. What we have as a consequence of what was said in 2015 is an Office of Missing Persons has been set up. An Office of Reparations has been set up. The Truth and Justice Commission has not been set up. And the government, and there again, irrespective of whichever party we are talking about, has rejected the notion of setting up setting up a war crimes accountability mechanism to look at war crimes with the participation of internationals. Now, the question with regard to that is very simply this, is that if the criminal justice system in Sri Lanka was working according to the way that it should, we would not have to be talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's precisely because the criminal justice commission system has failed to do that, that we have to bring it to international attention. And the suggestion is that you could have one judge who is a foreigner, whether it comes from Africa, Asia, the Commonwealth, wherever, and there could be a sunset clause saying that once the trust and confidence in the domestic judicial system has been restored, there will be no need for internationals. But that has been completely rejected. In fact, after the announcement in Geneva at the Human Rights Council of these mechanisms, the government did set up a consultative task force on these reconciliation mechanisms to find out from the general public what it thought about the government's proposals. I was secretary of that commission, and we told the government, look, you need to explain to the people first, what do you mean by reconciliation? What do you mean by transitional justice? They don't really know what you're talking about. The government came back and said, would you write the speech for us so that the president can go and make it? We wrote the speech was never made. But we continued with our consultations, both in terms of town hall type meetings, as well as focus group discussions. And we had about 7,500 submissions made overall. The point that was made by the people, both in the North as well as in the South, of the majority community and the minority community, was that we want an acknowledgement by the state of what has happened to our loved ones. We want the state to acknowledge it. What happens thereafter, whether there should be cases, whether there should be punishment, etc., was not the issue. They wanted to be acknowledged, and they felt that their recognition as full citizens of the country rested on the acknowledgement of what has happened to their loved ones. That, of course, has not happened. The Office of Missing Persons has been set up. There are something like 22,000 files that various previous commissions had also collected. The government has decided, nevertheless, to give out what is called certificates of absence to the families so that they can access bank accounts and other financial resources. But there is an unwillingness, a resistance on the part of the families to accept certificates of absence, to accept that their that their loved ones are dead. They want to know instead what has happened to them. The Office of Reparations too has continued to make payments, financial payments. The Truth and Justice Commission, the government was interested in. They talked to the South Africans. They were hoping that they could establish that in exchange for notions of amnesty. But I think the issue of a Truth and Justice Commission, of people coming and talking about the violations that they are responsible for, may not work culturally in our societies, because where they have worked, I think it's with societies that have a strong Christian tradition based on the notions of guilt, rather than in our societies where it is based on the notion of shame. Yeah. So what we've had since 2015 is this proposal, with two of the institutions that were proposed come into being, and complete silence or rejection with regard to the other two. In the meantime, though, what the Rajapaksa regime did was, instead of talking about transitional justice and reconciliation, they focused on economic development as they understood it, as a means of bringing everyone together. That did not work either. In the North and East, where the war was mainly fought, there is the largest concentration of the armed forces in the country. Furthermore, it is a civil society unfriendly government, and the space for any civil society activity has been shrunk considerably. As a consequence, one had to go back to Geneva to get yet another resolution passed on Sri Lanka, calling for accountability. And now what we have is an institution, a mechanism set up within the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to collect and collate information with regard to alleged human rights, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed by both sides in the Sri Lankan civil war. So we are at somewhat of a deadlock, if you like. The government is hoping that economic development will make people forget about the human rights violations. But the people are determined not to forget about it. And as I said, currently, they are now all engaged in island-wide protests to get rid of the Rajapaksas. Yeah. So I don't think we are going to move very far on transitional justice, and certainly not until the current question is resolved. What are the real stumbling blocks to transitional justice in Sri Lanka? One, of course, is that the argument of we can't turn war heroes into war criminals. And that is tied to the fact that the army, the armed forces, are drawn predominantly from the majority Sinhala Buddhist community, and that community is unwilling to come to terms with the injustices that have been made with regard to the minorities. Because apart from the issue of human rights in terms of war crimes and violations, etc., there is also the question of their political rights and freedoms that have to be granted, and that has yet to be done. Secondly, the Rajapaksa regime draws its legitimacy from the from the armed forces and from the Buddhist clergy. Unfortunately, in the Sri Lankan situation, the Buddhist clergy have not come out and talked about reconciliation. They have come out and talked about the justice of fighting against terrorism, but they have not come out and talked and taken an active part in the arguments about reconciliation. And so they are a major determinant of popular opinion and sentiment, and they need to be changed in that respect. Yeah. A third point, I suppose, is that allegations of war crimes and allegations of crimes against humanity are also leveled in particularly at the current president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was the defense secretary under his brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the current prime minister, but then the president. The Rajapaksas need to stay in power in order to see that their dynasty is fully institutionalized in the political fabric of the country. They recognize that if they leave power, they will probably be open to prosecution, universal jurisdiction, all of that. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, until he ran for the presidency, was a dual citizen of Sri Lanka and also of the United States. And it's possible that he can face civil prosecution. The United States has put travel bans on the commander of the army, who is a close associate of President Rajapaksa, etc. You know, so the stalemate continues. The determination of the families to seek justice also continues. What we need is in Sri Lanka a kind of paradigm shift to recognize that there is not just one nation, but many nations in the country, many peoples in the country who can be accommodated within the general rubric of being a Sri Lankan, but being a Sri Lankan Tamil, a Sri Lankan Sinhalese, a Sri Lankan Muslim. Instead of moving towards reconciliation, and any kinds of notions of justice, arguing that justice should be restorative justice rather than punitive justice, what the Rajapaksas did is to open up a new front of conflict with the other community, other minority community, that is the Muslim community. Now, this came to a head with the April 2019 Easter Sunday bombing atrocity, whereby allegedly Muslim extremists were responsible for killing Christians largely, Christian Sinhalese, but not just Sinhalese alone, in churches and in hotels. The Catholic Church alleges that there is a much deeper conspiracy and suggests that members of the current government, high-level members of the current government, could well have been involved in that attack. But the focus in terms of popular opinion and sentiment has been against the Muslim community. And you've had extremist Buddhist organizations spreading hate speech and inciting the Sinhala community to violence against the Muslims. And there have been instances of violence. In the context of the COVID pandemic, the government decided that anyone dying of COVID had to be cremated and could not be buried. This, of course, went against the fundamental tenets of not just the Muslim community, but other communities as well. But it was particularly focused against the Muslim community, and they were told that they could bury their dead only in one location. Despite local and international scientific opinion saying that there was no danger from burying people who died of COVID. Now, of course, all of that has been submerged, if you like, under the general campaign to get rid of the Rajapaksas. So to come back to it, transitional justice must be seen as an integral part of governance in a multi-ethnic, plural, diverse society. That is what Sri Lanka has always been. We have, whether we formally acknowledged it or not, practiced a notion of unity in diversity. But what we need is strong institutions and a proper, vibrant popular culture to animate that idea. The Rajapaksas are talking about one law, one country. And the fear of the minorities is that that one law, one country will be a singular Buddhist hegemonic state where the constitution says that it will be unitary and where it will make Buddhism, if not the official religion of the country, it will make it as it is. Article 9 of our constitution states it will have the foremost position. So a lot is set up that is opposing and resisting the moves towards transitional justice. But the push towards it has not died down, and I doubt it ever will. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Saravanamuttu. Because by reading your draft article, I learned a lot about Sri Lanka and then transitional justice, because everyone was wondering what would happen after 2009 when the war ended, and then afterwards there hasn't been much studies about transitional justice. But I think what you have summarized and then let us walk through, especially in terms of the relationship between the political complexity, you know, how the transitional justice is related to not just the regime and then, you know, national identity issues, and then, but also, you know, how the current situation in Sri Lanka would go along with the transitional justice. And then I think this is very insightful. I think there will be some questions and then some comments, I think, after the Q&A section. Thank you very much. Now we move to Dr. Wu on the Taiwan case. You are muted.
Oh, good afternoon. Uh, so I'm going to share my document. So, okay, okay. Uh, okay, thank you for the opportunity for me to share the experience of Taiwan. Uh, First of all, I'm going to share with you some political history background in Taiwan. Taiwanese nowadays are most the offspring of the Chinese immigrant who moved to Taiwan in 18th and 19th centuries. And in the late 19th century, the Japan defeated the Qing dynasty, so Taiwan was become a Japanese colonial rule. And at that period, they have some human right violation to local and indigenous people, and there's a convert woman issue. And then in the end of World War II, after defeat of Japan, the Taiwan was returned to China, and the Kennedy become the rulers. And there's a accident. The two main events. First is the 228 incident. Another one is the White Terror era during the martial law period. And in 1987, Taiwan experienced democratization. And since then, we have four power turnovers, actually three power turnovers. And now we passed the Huntington's, the two turnover test that become a democracy, consolidated democracy. So the two main issue in Taiwan's transitional justice is the first is about the 228 incident. It took place in between February and May 1947, and about 8,000 to 11,000 victims. And the since 1995, there's some measure to address this issue, and there's a compensation act, and hundreds of victims have been compensated. The background of the 228 incident is the conflict between native Taiwanese and the mainlander. During that time, the KMT government moved to Taiwan, and there's a gap between the Taiwanese and the mainlander about the governance, because Taiwan is relative peace for the past 50 years, and China is underwent the civil wars and the Japanese invasion. So the governance level is not really good. And there's at that time there's a civil war in mainland China, so there's inflation in Taiwan. Also, the identity of local people began to change. Some people do not strongly identify with China. So there's a there's a riot erupt across Taiwan, and about the governance issue and about the economic condition, and the Nanjing government sent troops to Taiwan and to suppress the riots. And another issue is the White Terror era is much longer. It's under the martial law from 1949 to 1987, about 30,000 to 70,000 military court cases. And from 1998, there's a government set up a compensation fund, and since then more than 10,000 cases were compensated. The background is the Cold War era. There's a strong antagonism across the Taiwan Strait, and the mainland China the communist China try to take over Taiwan. So Taiwan government has to impose some harsh measures that try to prosecute the spy from mainland China. But at the same time, the government also prosecute those people who are sympathetic to communism, and there are other people who promote political freedom, and so they will also be targeted by the government and become the victims. So the transitional justice in Taiwan, the beginning of the transition justice is the end of the authoritarian rule, and during the 1988, and when Li Denghui, the first Taiwanese president in power, took power after the the death of the authoritarian strongman Jiang Jingguo. And so there's some measure to address the transitional justice problem, the transitional issue. So there's some compensation and then some report about the truth of the historical event, and there's a apology for the historical events. And then after 2002 and until 2008, the DPP took power. The year 2000 is the first year of the power turnover in Taiwan, and but that time the DPP only control the executive branch, and do not control the parliament. So it's an 8-year minority government. So it tried to implement some measure to restore the 228 and the white terror victims' reputation. But on the other hand, he tried to deal with the ill-gotten property by political party, by KMT. During the authoritarian era, the KMT accumulated a large amount of wealth and become its own party assets. And that party assets is spent during each election and make the election unfair. So the DPP tried to deal with that issue, but because it's a minority government, he cannot get the law passed. And at that time, the attention from the public is also low. And then is the President Ma Ying-jeou's period from 2008 and 2016, and he reopened the investigation into 2 cases, but did not find convincing conclusion. And he established the National Human Rights Museums, and he apologized again and again about the 228 accident and the white terrors. But the family member of the victim do not quite appreciate his apology, because the KMT still worship the authoritarian rulers, and there's some issue begin to deal with the Japanese colonial rules, like the comfort issue on the Takasago volunteer, who is a Taiwanese minority who sent to the Southeast Asia to fight during the World War II. And then the Tsai Ing-wen come to power in 2016. It's the first time the opposition party who control both the executive and the legislative power. And new legislation were able to be passed, like the ill-gotten party asset, the target, the KMT's party asset, and promoting transitional justice, and assessing the political archive. He opened the political archive for public to read and to do some analysis. So in this way, people can realize what the perpetrator really do during the authoritarian era. And he established the two commissions, the Transitional Justice Commission and the Ill-Gotten Party Asset Settlement Committee, to deal with the transitional justice. And for indigenous people, he do some apology, but do not do much beyond that. So there's because the white arrow, white terror eras cases were open to the public, so people can do some statistics about the distribution of the cases in different period. As we can see, most of the cases are concentrated during the earlier period, especially during the 1951 to 1960, the beginning of the Cold War. And later on, there's still a lot of cases, but they register gradual decline. And the implement of the transitional justice. So Taiwan's transitional justice was mainly concentrated focus on the KMT's rules. And because KMT during the authoritarian rule, they have two acts, and they use the Betray Punishment Act and the Article 100 of the criminal law to prosecute and punish those people who do not follow his rules. And until now, the complete final report about the white terror has not been published. So the current trend regarding transitional justice, the Taiwan's transitional justice can be characterized by compensating the victims but forgetting the perpetrators. The one main reason I think is that the Huntington's argument, if the former authoritarian government is still able to stay in power after democratic transition, it will not agree quick, complete transitional justice. So because the KMT is still in power, either in control the presidency or it was still a powerful force in the parliament, so it can block the proposal to make the transitional justice go quicker. And the DPP government also choose to prioritize holding institutional perpetrator accountable and postpone dealing with the authoritarian ruler to avoid the social unrest. Because the authoritarian ruler have some symbol, like especially in Taiwan, there's some ethnic division between the mainlander and the native Taiwanese, and the DPP supporter are mainly the native Taiwanese, and KMT elite are composed of mainly the mainlander. And so their people's view about the transitional justice are really associated with their party identity. So the transitional justice is involved or correlated with the ethnic cleavage. So it's more make it a somewhat a sensitive issue. So the DPP first choose to hold in the institutional perpetrator like KMT's party asset, and the organization they joined the KMT, but they do not. They try to postpone the issue about the two former presidents. And they also do not hold the individual perpetrator accountable, like those judges or prosecutors. They are still in office, but they are commit some injustice during the authoritarian rule, but they are still in office. And the last three, but on the other hand, in Taiwan, the social atmosphere has changed because the the younger generation, they are more identified with Taiwan and less sympathetic to KMT's position, and they are not, they do not have authoritarian nostalgia, and they tend to expose more liberal ideas. So in the long run, we will see more pressure on the government to erase those authoritarian symbols like monuments or organizations. And but we also have to know that not the issue about the political context, it has less stressed in the discussion, because in the White Terror era, it was took place during the Cold War. So in the 1950s, the political threats posed by mainland China was immense and imminent, and many people or government at that time didn't believe Taiwan will survive. So at that time, we have also Korean War and the Kinmen bombs and some international events. So given the background, some of the harsh measures to stabilize the regime on the island are likely to be understandable. But of course, there's no due process for the trial at that time, and many of the victims are innocent. But the international political context should be part of the conversation. And also, after 1960, the tension between the two camps declined, and Taiwan has stabilized. And still, they have some international conflict, but the necessity of imposing political repression to ensure security of Taiwan was reduced significantly. So the repression in this period served to a significant degree only to secure authoritarian rules. So we need to differentiate the political context, and then we are able to assess the responsibility that the government, the decision maker, should bear. And until now, the DPP government, the ruling party, doesn't want to talk much about this. And for Japanese colonial rules, that's another issue. But in Taiwan, the discussion was not was not widely discussed, and so but there is some issue like the reparation of Taiwanese who served in the military during the World War II and the comfort women issues. But a few political party or civil society organization seems to be very interested in point out the issues. And the main reason, I think, is to avoid irritating Japan, and who is an important ally of Taiwan. The punchline is that China's military threat was so immense, and to counter such threat, we must have not irritating our important allies. So political party to a different degree choose to omit this issue. So, but most of the victims are agents, so this issue need to be addressed soon. So that's my report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wu. And then by reading your draft, I also learned of many issue about the Taiwanese case, especially compared to the Sri Lankan case, especially Sri Lankan case out of civil war, intense period was there. And then in the Taiwan case, there was a 228, which is a very intense phase, but afterwards, it was a very long time of the White Terror, which lasted a long time, and then more systematic. And then it shows a little bit of difference how the government could react to a different kind of human rights violation. So, and then I think something that you mentioned about the international political context is also important thing, which also affected, could affect Sri Lanka and the Korea. And then I think it's a very important issue. Okay, thank you. All right, so as now I move to my presenter role, and then I'll make a presentation. Okay. Okay, so let me start my presentation on the Korean case, the transitional justice in Korea. First, let me show you the transition of the political transition in South Korea. And then as you can see, the history of a political transition in South Korea from 1910 to 2012 involves different regimes, and then some Japanese colonialism, and then some brief moment of the US rule, and then the Korean government, which start with the dictator Lee Seung-man, and then military general Park Chung-hee, and then Chun Doo-hwan, and then afterwards democratization. Throughout the phase of political transition, we had a severe major unrest, which sometimes led to the human rights violation, and then major issues. For example, the U.S. rule was the Jeju events, which was happened in the Jeju Island, and then Yeosu events, which has many people killed, and then also the Korean War was there, and then we had the coups, and then every political moves ended up with some kind of a political transitions. So, for example, the first transition we had was about the liberation from the Japanese colonial rule. And then with a brief moment of the US military occupation, it ended with a real independence in 1948 and the creation of the Republic of Korea. And then, of course, right after that, we experienced the Korean War, 3 years. And then we also experienced the transition from the war to peace in 1953. However, after that, the dictatorship lasted by Lee Seung-man, which is a patriarchal dictatorship, and then that was overthrown by the student revolution in 1960. However, immediately, there was a coup, and then which is another political turmoil. And then because after that, President Park Chung-hee, the military general, was in power, and then in the later phase, he tried to have a dictatorship, and then that also ended in assassination and then the coup. And then we briefly had a movement called the Seoul Spring at the time, but it didn't last because of the coup. But the full democratization, at least in an institutional fashion, came after the Chun Doo-hwan in 1987. So the long history, and then a lot of upheavals, and then many events shows that there was many political transitions and then human rights violations. I categorized the human rights violation in Korea into 4 types of human rights violation. The first one is the human rights violation during the Japanese colonial regime. And then the second, under the military occupation of the US, and then internal unrest between 1945 and then 1948. And then the human rights violation during the Korean War. And of course, because this was a time of the war, and then a lot of people were killed by the enemies, North Koreans, and then the Chinese army. But many people were also killed by the Korean military, by the Korean military police or the military or the police, in order to secure the rear front of the war. So that also caused a lot of the civilian death, especially people with a socialist inclination or some kind of a previous communist or the socialist activities, and their families were rounded up and then they were murdered, not at the front line, but at the rear end of the war. And then many civilians were killed by the Korean military, and then also some cases like Nogunli, which is killed by the US military. And then after that, we had a very similar period of white terror as the Taiwan, which is a long period of very systematic but small, not the largest scale, but compared to that, war and then unrest, the human rights violation, the number itself was lower, but continued systematic human rights violation, including the torture, mass torture and killing, and then the disappearance, and then the arrest and detentions, illegal. So those happened afterwards. The Korean government, after the formal democratization in 1987, have created many commissions, and then many trials, and then sometimes reparation commissions in order to address the past human rights violation. So these are the examples of the three commissions, which shows that the one of the biggest ones, the Jeju Commission, and then Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea, and then the Commission on the Suspicious Death, which is among other commissions, which are the largest one. Let me show you what kind of efforts the Korean government made after the transitions. So I don't expect you to read, all the measures that the Korean government have done, but I just want to show you what kind of measures were adopted and then devised in order to address the past human rights violation. So in terms of the Japanese colonialism, immediately there were commissions and special courts in order to address the past human rights violation. And then it also continued after 2010 regarding the forced labor, and then regarding the victims of the overseas, the military conscription by the Japan. And then the industrial conscription. And then for the internal unrest, also something was made in 2000, 2020. And then the Korean War, also there was a measure during the Korean War in 1951, but also afterwards until 2005. And then also here, the repression by the non-democratic regimes, where there was various measures here. Let me show you the three characteristics of these Korean measures. The first one is that it was heavily dependent on the truth commissions. So Professor Wu mentioned that the Taiwan model, which is a combination of the compensation and then forgetting the perpetrator. The South Korean case probably is a truth-seeking and then the forgetting of the perpetrator. So many of the red marked ones are all truth commissions. One that focuses on finding what happened, or trying to find how the person died, or whereabouts persons, or sometimes finding out the remains of the person. Okay, so truth commission, heavily dependent on truth commission. The second aspect is that there had been earlier efforts of transitional justice, usually immediately after the transition or immediately after the human rights violation occurred. So for example, for the Japanese colonialism, something happened in 1948. And then for the Korean War, during the Korean War, and then after about 10 years, there was a commission created. But these blue marked ones were all failed at that time, regarded as a failure. And then because of the failure, later, in 2004, 5, 2008, and then 1993, all those are the later efforts to address exactly the same issue that has been attempted but failed. Okay, so it is kind of a lot of trial and fail and then redone of the truth commissions. The third categorization is that about the timing. So South Korea recently had 3 truth commissions initiated. So 2020, the Truth Commission on the May 18th Democracy Movement, which is about Gwangju. And then in 2021, the Truth Reconciliation Commission, the second phase of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then this year, the Yeosu Suncheon incident Truth Commission has been started. Interestingly, what these the green marked ones shows is that it depends on the regime. So which kind of regime, which is currently the Moon government, which is currently will soon end its tenure, but the Moon government, which is more sympathetic to the past, the victims, and then the addressing of the past human rights violation, they continuously create the new commissions. But if you compare that, the green ones, And then if you try to find the, anything that happened in 2010, it's very difficult to find. So from 2009 to 2017, there was very few efforts to address the past human rights violations. That is because that was the time when the Lee Myung-bak and then Park Geun-hye regime, which is a conservative regime, which is more close to the military and police and then the previous authoritarian powers, were in charge in the administration. So at that time, there was almost no efforts to address the past human rights violation. So this kind of shows that the Korean, the path. Okay, so in the remaining time, rather than going into what these details about what the human rights violations are and then what kind of efforts they were made, I'll address some implications. And then let me show you the first one. The first one, implications that I want to emphasize in my final paper is about the achievement of the transitional justice measures. It is very difficult to, because a lot of truth commissions were made and then a lot of efforts were made, it is hard to deny that there were some consequences. There were some achievements of these transitional justice measures. So I think, I organized the efforts of these achievements into the three kinds of the criteria, three categories. The first one is, of course, because South Korea focused on truth commissions, the finding the new truth was the one. And then the second one is a policy and then practice reform, some changes, some positive changes. And then last one is very slow, but is still ongoing, is seeking accountability. The accountability is not going in a direction of punishing the perpetrators, but it is going of having a more retrial of the past or clearing someone out of the previous false convictions. Okay, but still, this is a form of accountability. So for truth cases, the fact finding and confirmation has been made. So, for example, the many of the cases ended up with the government recognizing and then acknowledging the past human rights violations, and then providing the official status to the existing fact, and then sometimes the excavation of the remaining of the victims. So, for example, these kind of efforts were made in order to address, and then these are the government apologies by president recognizing. Okay. And then the civic education was also made, so the people are more sensitive about the human rights and democracy. So it contributed to the societal efforts. The policy and practices are more about the governmental apologies, memorial services, or the official government revision, history textbooks, and then government. And then the politicians are more cautious about addressing the past issues, and then institutions and memorial parks. So some of them I show you here is that memorial institutions that is created on Jeju. So all these kind of things have been made, some other human rights violation. And then last one, the accountability. Some of them have sought clear their names of the past false convictions. And then many trials are still ongoing. And then the retrials are happening. So in the form of accountability, of course, we had former President Jeon Do-han Rotae stood on the trial and then convicted. But the main charge was not about the human rights violation per se, but it was more about the coup, the illegality of the coup, and then illegal assets or the corruption issues that was at the focus. So, but still, the accountability issues came later, especially after the investigation. The Truth Commission reports were out, and then sometimes these reports were used as evidence in the court that these people were able to clear their names of, being a communist or the being a spy or the being a social activist who are trying to make a revolutionary efforts against South Korea. So all those kind of false accusation or the false conviction has been cleared based on the Truth Commission report. That doesn't mean that the South Korean efforts are without any, difficulties. We still have challenges, and then as you have seen, depending on the regime. So whether it's a conservative regime, which is close to military and police and authoritarian past, and then the progressive regime, which is more victim friendly, and then human rights focused. Depending on who are in the power, the destiny and then the history of human transitional justice has been there has been many ups and downs. Okay, so I think that will also repeat in the past as the new government, which is a conservative government, comes in. A lot of activities that has been started in the Moon administration, which is a progressive regime, will have a very difficult time for sure. Okay, let me sum up my presentation with the three observations or the implication something I found from the South Korean case. The first one is that, as you have seen, uh, the more cases are failure rather than the success themselves. Okay, so in many cases, the more failure cases was there than the success cases in general. So this whole transitional justice was never a easy or the smooth or the natural processes. And then, as I mentioned, it was innately contentious and conflictual and then contested processes. But in the long term, because South Korea started transitional justice in 1987, and then if we trace the long history, in the end, we saw some convergences and then some reconciliation. So at a certain point, even the conservative regime or the representative acknowledged a very minimum fact about human rights violation and then state responsibility. So it is not without any achievement, but it is contested, but it is converging into a certain understanding. I think that is important lesson. The second one is that the Korean transitional justice is not just a isolated or something that happens in a vacuum. It also happens within the development of the international human rights and then also the human rights in South Korea. So as the Korean government become more mature in terms of the democracy, and then also Korea becomes more open to looking at the global democracy and then have a more interaction with the global democracy. I think there has been more demand for the Truth Commission and then trial. So I think the generation effects are certainly important ones. So as citizens become aware of the human rights development in other countries and then are more aware of the transitional justice in other countries, like think about what is happening in the US. Think about universities and the society going back over their slavery history. I think all those things have some interaction with the South Korean efforts about addressing their past and then what is normal and then what is good in terms of the human rights. The last one is that because of the regime changes, the frequent regime changes in South Korea, the victims are highly sensitive to re-traumatization because whenever there was a conservative regime, which is not friendly to the human rights violation in the past or transitional justice, they sometimes deny about the past efforts or sometimes cut the funding, or sometimes when the new conservative governments come in, the societal actors who are against transitional justice become more vocal. And then in that certain processes, the victims become re-traumatized. And then sometimes victims are more hesitant to come forward to address the past issues. So all these things were existed in South Korea. So the South Korean case shows that the transitional justice cannot be once and for all or the process. It is a continuing process. But the one thing, I think similar with the Sri Lankan case, I think one thing I realized in Korean cases are victims or the activists who are sympathetic to the victims are so resilient because they have grievances until those grievances and then the rancor and sometimes the anger is diminished or disappeared, they will be politically active and then socially active, and they will be demanding whenever there is a chance to. So I think this is a one power or the one momentum that moves the transitional justice in South Korea. So I'll stop here, and then I'll now go back to my moderator function, and then I'll lead the discussion. So I think we are a little behind, but I think remaining 20 minutes time, I think we can have a certainly good discussion comparing, the South Korea, Taiwan, and then Sri Lankan cases. So I don't think there is any question from the audiences, but I think this is a time. If you have any question, you can send the staff the question. We can address those questions with you. I think that'd be great. Otherwise, while waiting for some questions, as a moderator, and then I also had a very interesting time hearing the two other presentations. So if you have any questions or comments, you can raise your hand. Okay. Yes, Dr. Wu.
Yes, I want to ask about the compensation in your transitional justice scheme,
Yeah.
because it's important in Taiwan. First thing we think about transitional justice is to compensate the family of the victim with money, and I didn't see you mention about this part. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think the compensation. I think there's a compensation. Something that I also was going to ask you about the Taiwan case, because you said that the Taiwan case is a compensation and then not focusing on the perpetrators, but the South Korean case was more truth, and then we move on to the compensation. Well, in Korean case, I think some cases were started with the 228 model, focusing on the reparations, or they didn't refer to it as a reparation, but compensations. But the Gwangju cases, that they started with giving reparation to the individual victims. Okay. And then I think as early as 1987, and then they started with the reparation committee, and then they investigated who the victims are. And then after finding out, screening out the victims, and then they gave individual members some money for the reparations. Okay. But in other cases, I think the Korean government and then activists, for example, did not focus on compensations. They were focusing more on the collective compensation in the first, meaning that the victims get their memorial site, or research foundations, or or memorials, or the museums, I think, as a compensation for the collectives. But I think the Korea at this point, especially, are moving toward the individual compensation, because after they find the truth and then got the collective compensation, and then the last frontier, a lot of activists think, is an individual compensation. So the government passed the law, and then I think the administrative process has been started to giving out the individual victims a compensation. I think they are receiving those monetary compensation at this point. So I think the kind of sequence is very interesting in terms of, especially comparing with the Taiwan and the Korea.
Can I just ask, in both the Korean cases and the Taiwanese case, the compensation issue seems to have had some salience, whereas in our case in Sri Lanka, compensation has never been the real ask. It has been much more the question of the acknowledgement of what happened, and the state's acknowledgement in particular of what happened. Can either of you shed any light on why that would be the case? As to why, compensation has taken much more of a salient role in your experiences than in ours?
Dr. Wu, I think because Taiwan case started with the compensation process first, I think it's a bit more because South Korean case was more about acknowledging first, and then the collective compensation,
Okay.
then individual
Okay.
compensation. So the truth has to be there in the first.
Yes.
I think in the Taiwan case, I don't know, Dr. Wu could answer.
I I guess I think this has to be make a thorough research to answer the question. But I think the one likely reason is that the number of victims are relatively limited in Taiwan. Like the 22AS incident, there are less than 1,000 people of which are traced, can be traced. Actually, victim might be higher than that, but because it's 70 years ago, so it's a long time ago, so it's less than 10,000 people. And for the white terror, it's less than 10,000 people. So I think it's manageable. Another reason is that I think because KMT was in power for most of the time, and it's a sensitive issue to really to judge the authoritarian rulers or to make some monument who reveal the misconduct of their former leaders. So they rather spend some money and to compensate, to close the events. I think close the events. That's what I think. Yeah.
So in the Taiwanese case, the payment of compensation constituted a kind of closure. There was no question of prosecution or anything like that after compensation was paid. That was the conclusion of the case, as it were.
Yeah, I think the KMTs was thinking about that, but the opposition party he want more. They want more. They want the truth.
They
and
want
who did all the things.
Okay.
Yeah. So they have a different demands. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we have one question from the audience. Kang Na-kyung asked, let me read the question. I think this is about the South Korean one. So thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I have a question on the Korean case. Why did the Yosu TJ commissions, which was created in 2022, long after the incident? Does it have an impact on the TJ process? Okay, let me answer that question because the Yosu case is very important case. Victims, when it happened in 1948, the victims continuously made an effort to create the Truth Commission, even within the regional government, not the national government, but the regional government, the local society. But because this event was a event that started as a mutiny by the military, the communist, oriented some soldiers was a habit. Started a mutiny, and then in order to have that insurgency quelled, the national government and the national military came in and then killed not only those military but also many innocent victims. But so continuously victims tried to raise their voices, but because of the issue itself, it was very difficult to have the unified voice about how to deal with the past. And then many people didn't sympathize with this issue because they thought this is a rebellion, especially known as a Yeosu Suncheon Communist Rebellion. So I think because of that strong ideological shackle that it has with the events itself, although it had a lot of the civilian death, that it took a long time. But because of the local activists' efforts, it was possible to create the transitional truth commissions. And I think it is right that, as you mentioned, it is the impact of the other truth commissions. They have seen what the Jeju have done. They have seen what happened to the Korean War victims, and then they have seen what the Gwangju, after 30 or after 40 years, create the Truth Commission. And then they been more actively participated in advocating for the Truth Commission. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting question. Is there any other question or comments among? If not, can I ask you, Saravanamuttu, about Sri Lanka, and then especially that you mentioned about the religion was very interesting to me. So learning from the other country model like Rwanda or the Europe cases, you said it might not be good because in the Sri Lanka, it is not, they are focusing on the culture of the guilt, but in Sri Lanka, it's more about shame, right? Can you elaborate any more about this culture behind the shame and then why it is blocking the transitional justice?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, is that, you know, if the model of the Truth Commission is a la South Africa, for example, where people come and make full confession of the wrongs that they did, in the Sri Lankan case, an individual coming and making that full confession will then cast a blight on his family. That a member of this family has come out and said that they have done such and such. And as a consequence, there are all the implications of can his sisters be married off? Do you want to get married to the sister of a war criminal or a self-confessed person who did such a horrendous thing? There is all of that. Whereas I think the Christian notion of sort of guilt and about confession and all of that makes for a greater motivation to come out and say, yes, I did this wrong. I am now confessing and I ask for forgiveness. Yes. Is the kind of thing. Because I can't think of a situation in which a country where this has happened has had a sort of non-Christian culture. Yeah. So there is that issue.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, now I understand what you mean by the culture of shame and how it blocks the transitional justice.
It's much more sort of collective, whereas the guilt is individualized.
Okay, I see. Dr. Wu, what you have said about the new generation, I think I found that very interesting. I think that is relevant to Korea and then also Sri Lanka. And as you mentioned that because the victims has been, they will not stop. And then because if the human rights and then these ideas will become more and more prevalent, they will demand more for the government.
Exactly.
So in terms of Taiwan, Dr. Wu, this kind of the removing of the authoritarian symbols like the statue of Chiang Kai-shek, and then renaming of the museum, was the young generation particularly behind this demand to remove the authoritarian symbols, or was it more a traditional the progressive DPP politicians who were at the forefront?
I can't really tell I think both of them. I think the young people are more likely to make big progress, but the DPP government was a little bit conservative about this issue, because if you quickly change or even tear down the memorial hall, then there will be some social conflict, because some mainlanders who followed Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, and they and their offspring think that Chiang Kai-shek was the one who saved their lives. So I don't think the KMT, the DPP will rush to deal with that issue. And on the other hand, the KMTs are beginning to think about the propose some. They propose some changes to the the Chiang Kai-shek's Memorial Hall, like turn into it into a library, presidential library or something. Yeah. So, but the young people, I think, that are the forefront, as you said, of the issues. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any comments? I'm still waiting for the audience, whether they have a question, but meantime, we can still discuss. And is there any question about the final products that we should engage with? Yes, Dr. Wu.
Yes, I have a question because I heard the Korean cases, but I did not find much discussion about the Japanese. I think it's to me it's like an important issue in Korea, but you do not mention the Japanese rule, and so I'm wondering, I am curious about the different parties' position toward
I
the
see.
issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the reason I left out the Japanese part is more diplomatic issue, between Korea and then the Japan. And then in this case, who are accountable and then who should take action is Japan. So the Korea have to demand for the matters. But in this paper, I focused on the Korean government's transitional justice measures. So that's the reason why. But I think what you are saying, and then hearing a lot about this Korean-Japan conflict about the past human rights violation, I think it's very important issue. And I think the Korean government has been roughly divided between the conservative regime and then the progressive regime. The progressive regime is more toward the cherishing the value of the principle of human rights. So they think that anything that has done, especially the comfort women issue, which is a the women's right issue, and then the forced labor, that should be resolved, and then we should get the formal apology from Japan, official apology from Japan, and then also the reparations. Okay. And on the other hand, the conservative have been more lenient in terms of the Japanese guilt, and then they look at the Japan-Korea relations and then the kind of futuristic vision. So I think there's a clear divide in terms of the political sides. But interestingly, what triggered the most recent the big news between the Japan is not the government action. It was more about the court decisions. So the Korean government has a strict division between the administrative and legislative and then judicial branches. And then it was the judicial branches, because the victims brought the issue into the Korean court, made the decisions, and then they come up and then reflecting the many of the international human rights principles, they have made the decisions, and then they have to sometimes demanded that Japanese companies have to compensate for the forced labor. So I think in a sense there is because of the division between administrative and then the judiciary. I think it is true that there's not much that the government can do, but I think it's something that initiated by the judiciary, and then that causes the problem at this point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, so I think there's no more question from the audience, and I think I have to wrap up. And I think this was a good discussion, especially three very different countries: there's Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and then the South Korea, looking at the human rights violation, transitional justice. I think this was a very meaningful discussion of the past. There is certainly the similarities among these three countries, international political context, and then also the past human rights issues is tangled with the current human rights, the political conditions, depending on the different political parties. I think it is a very universal issue about the transitional justice. But individual countries also have their different characteristics. So Sri Lanka has in a stalemate and then have a long way, probably. It will probably wait until 10 or 20 years to resolve the issue in certain form. And then the Taiwan, which started earlier in 1992, but renewed attention after the DPP was in power. So they have their own problems and then emphasis on compensation. And then the Korean government with the different kinds of the issues. And then also, which I didn't mention, is about the North Korea. We have to resolve the issue with it. So each individual have a different particularity and then the specific aspects. So I think we will continue on the discussion. And then for that matter, I would like to thank all the participants of the seminar and then the audiences for their valuable time and then sharing your expertise. So thank you very much. So I will wrap it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.